Hello, friends, one and all. Welcome to the Merry Corncrakes podcast, the official podcast for the Corncrake magazine. Corncrake magazine is a wonderful publication, comes out every month online for free, looking at classic stories and great tales written by contemporary independent writers. Go to thecorncrakemag.com to find out more about it and enjoy yourself. This past month, we've been doing a bit of a series. It's a bit of a kind of accident how it's come together. It wasn't planned this way, but one video has led to another video, and it's been looking at the future of fantasy. Where are we now? Where has fantasy been before? And where do we think it's going? And the last video with Brothers Grimm, we looked at fantasy as maybe having a quasi religious role, perhaps, or fulfilling a deep need within human nature. And kind of maybe launching from that point and building upon these things and maybe offering some distinctions, I'm delighted to say I have with me today Mr. Philip Wortmann. Hello, Philip. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How are you doing?
And oh, I'm doing great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to have you here as always. I'm always grateful for your time and for your insights. And when the last episode went out, you wrote a long comment underneath it, clearly engaged by the content, but also with a distinction that you felt had been missed or could needed to be further explored. So why tell us what was on your mind when you heard what we were saying?
Yeah, clearly there was quite a lot on my mind, and I don't know how comprehensive it was, seeing as I just unleashed the internal keyboard warrior within me. But yeah, I think the distinction that I wanted to drive at was the distinction between fantasy and folklore, because I think fantasy is a derivative of a deep need within the human being to engage with something that cannot be engaged with on a purely material level, I think, or on a purely sensory level. There's something transcendent that one is trying to grasp at when one engages with fantasy, but I think fantasy is a derivative of folklore and is dependent on folklore. And so I wanted to speak a bit about why there's I think, a significant difference between fantasy and folklore, even though fantasy falls under the umbrella of folklore as a subcategory, I would say, and what the role of a lore keeper is, I think, in that sense as well. That lore keepers are often also the ones who spin wonderful fantasies, but they also have another more primary role to serve. And I think the critique that was offered by Brothers Grimm last time is really on point, and I really agree with that. That we should spend more time as writers or even as readers engaging with the lore that lore keepers have received and passed on from generation to generation and are really keeping in that sense. And that we should treat fantasy as that which it is, namely a derivative and a fruit of the lore that is actually the ground from which it kind of grows up and springs from.
So I guess a question that is kind of invited here is what when you say folklore, what do you mean by that in distinction from fantasy? Because some people might think, well, myth and folk tale might be different things, but you're saying folklore. So what are you what significance are you attaching that term?
Yeah, so I think the different categories that I learned when I studied ancient cultures in Pretoria here in South Africa was the distinction between myth as being like the very cosmic origin of all things in the form of a poetic telling. And that doesn't need to be taken literally. It can also be seen as poetic. But it is the way in which the cosmology is kind of condensed into one narrative and, yeah, or not literary, but poetic telling that can be passed on from generation to generation. So you've got the category of myth, and then you've got the category of legend, which is more pseudo-historical in the sense that I learned it. I don't know if I would still agree with that, but that is then kind of a second category, which is tied more directly into actual historical events and can, as a result, also be to degrees discovered in archaeological finds or discussed in historical conversation. Then you've got folklore, which is a much broader and much more difficult to define category. And I know it's only a word that was coined by the English and has only been around for like the past 200 or 300 years. So it's a relatively new concept, but I guess all of these attempts to define and categorize are a result of academia, the way we know it, even though the Greeks probably also tried to do some other things. But so I would say folklore is an umbrella category that tries to define what it is that nations do, or that the priests and those who maintain the cult and the culture of a nation, what these figures do within that nation, and then what that nation does as a result. Because I think it always permeates from a kind of priestly class into the household and becomes the culture, the dominant culture, and the area in which one lives. And I think it has roots in something that is not merely made up. I think that's why these figures are often called law keepers and not law creators or something like that. They are inheriting things, and passing them on.
That's an important point, I think, because when you were talking about that, I was thinking about the role of the half-keepers in ancient Greece and Rome, how at the center of the city, and Plato talks about this, other figures do too, the rulers or the leader would be responsible for maintaining the hearth, which maintains the life of the city and its connection with the divine, and of course mirrors the divine hearth in Mount Olympia, and is actually in some way contributing or participating in that. But then each household would also have its own hearth, which the leader, usually the patriarch of the house, would have responsibility for. In Rome, that there's a slightly different version of this with the Vestal Virgins as well. But there's this idea that from the center, from the leadership, the priestly leader who maintains this tradition from the founding of the city, which is done by the first hearthkeeper who's found the first fire. It's not something he created; he found it or was given it to maintain. Then the rest of the city kind of gets its structure and meaning from that same tradition and same way of being. To me, that's very different from. And again, you have to be careful, because somebody like Tolkien might argue he didn't read. His understanding of creation is quite nuanced. Artistic creation. It's not just from him. He thinks there's something beyond, or the divine has some role in his artistic activity. But you might say that it isn't the same kind of relationship as somebody who's just carrying on a tradition. There's a new formulation being made here. There's a new departure for a specific purpose that isn't going to be continued by somebody else. Like Tolkien's, again, there's a question there, but Tolkien's writings are not then meant to be setting the scene for somebody to be the next king of Gondor, as it were.
Exactly. I think, well, I need to read more of Tolkien, Tolkien's letters and so on. I think there I still have a bit of a gap. But my understanding is also that he is creating what he calls a secondary world. Or I remember in an interview, I think he says something along the lines of he's writing history, but at a different stage of imagination, which was a description that I really like, because he also, I think it's in the preface to The Lord of the Rings, says that he prefers calling his work history writing, so it's some form of historiography. But at the same time, I don't think you would consider his own work necessarily to be divinely inspired in the same way as like the sacred scriptures are, maybe. Although, yeah, again, I would have to read more of what Tolkien is writing to understand his concept of inspiration, maybe. But you spoke about the Greeks, and it also reminded me of Hesiod, who says that the revelation that he becomes is from the muses and from the gods and from divinity, and that they know how to tell lies, but what they are telling him is the truth, in fact. So to him is being revealed a truth, in a similar way as truth is revealed to oracles and so on. So that there's a claim at the root of what is being passed on from one generation to the next, that it does come from beyond. It is revealing that spiritual reality for which the human being has a desire and a need, but it's actually rooted in it is the very foundation of reality in in a lot of ways, that defines the cosmos and how it works. And I wouldn't agree with what Hesiod writes, but I'm a Christian and becoming a pastor. So in that sense, I am a lawkeeper of the biblical canon. And I would also say that's rooted very much in reality and so on, and has a lot of historical, there where it's meant to be historical. It is rooted in history as well. But at the same time, within scripture, you've got, within a historical work, like the book of Judges, you've got, I think it's in Judges 9, there's a character that arises, a prophet called Jotham, who tells a fable. And it's about trees walking from one tree to the next and asking this tree to be their king, and it declines because it's, fulfilling its function, producing wine or olive plants and olives. So you've got the story that's clearly fantastical, embedded in a historical telling. And there one can still, and you've got this lore keeper who's telling a fantasy, but there's a clear distinction between that which is fantastical and that from which the fantastical necessarily borrows, namely the true lore, or the reality in which we live. And I think that's also the distinction that Tolkien quite clearly makes when he speaks about subcreation as opposed to creation.
Yes, that's fair, and he does talk about poetry and fantasy having a kind of reflection of the true lore in his view, that the gospel, Jesus Christ coming into the world and redeeming humanity. His stories reflect that. They imbibe that because that's what fairy stories do, due to their structure, due to the fact there's that kind of moment of near absolute defeat and then sudden reversal. So the moment of grace entering in. But that doesn't mean every fairy story is kind of on the same level. It's because it shares in that, or it's showing that fundamental story, which it gains its power. But I guess there's one thing I was thinking about when you were speaking was that to some extent, some of these stories might seem very similar. Then a fantasy story might seem similar to certain religious texts or mythological texts and so on. But part of the difference isn't just the origin, but the kind of purpose and who it's addressed to. So if you think of, like, let's go to Homer, for example, or Hesiod, these works were not just for isolated individuals to do with whatever they want and to have an entertaining experience. But when you think of, like, the Greeks and listening, the community is listening to the songs of their people, and it's a commentary upon them and their relationship to the world and how the world relates to them and the source of being, as you mentioned. The Gospels and the epistles and the Book of Judges, as you said, these were not first and foremost texts to be read by individuals. Indeed, oftentimes they would be read aloud to a gathered community, to be heard together and then be used for instruction, for example, for further growth in connection to the source of all life. So whereas I don't think even any fantasy book would ever claim that kind of significance unless it starts moving into the religious sphere. It's first and foremost an individual's entertainment.
Yeah, and there with the religious sphere, I think of C.S. Lewis with the Narnia books, or the classics, because he definitely does take in a very intentionally allegorical direction, and tries to bring those. And I think in that sense, it is like Jotham's fable of the trees, because it is an explicit attempt to communicate the gospel by means of fantasy, and his fantasy then again borrows from the stock of of the true lore in a sense, or at least the folklore that makes the claim to be received from honest roots at some level. So he refers to, Greek myth and legend and so on in order to populate his worlds and the like. So he's very clearly not only borrowing from the gospel, but also from other folklore. And I think it's what makes his world you can engage with. I don't know if it's relatable, but it's accessible maybe because the ideas which he populates his world with and the characters, they're not completely foreign. It's not so foreign that it drives you away, as opposed to maybe some fantasy which intentionally is very different. And yet that's then a game that the author of that kind of fantasy is playing on purpose. Maybe like Lewis Carroll would be an example, who was an absurdist and he really liked to just be absurd, even though he did have a lot of mathematical and theological ideas contained in his work. So I don't know how absurd he actually was, but it was definitely something that fascinated him.
How then, like, I mean, this raises a big question though, because a lot of people today wouldn't see themselves as law keepers, or and I'm just thinking about writers here. I'm not talking about the beyond that sphere, because that's we're interested in writing stories.
Yes.
And the fantasy genre, we're kind of saying, well, it's derivative, but it's not fundamentally in the same vein as maintaining or perpetuating a tradition, of keeping a tradition going, or sharing that tradition. Might have elements of it, but it's not that. So how do we kind of bridge those two worlds? Should we try to bridge those two worlds, or is it actually, no, these are two separate things, and the writers just need to keep on what they're doing, and the lawkeepers are a separate kind of entity?
Yeah, well, I can't really speak for anyone else, but maybe it is a bit of an admonition from my perspective that one can take to heart if one wants. That I think you are necessarily a lore keeper if you are writing fantasy. I think, like, you were at points you were considering going into the ministry. I think it's also rooted in this desire to be well grounded in the real source material, so that you can discern between what is real and what is fictional or fantastical, and that you've got a rich wealth of nutrients in the ground with which you're working, on which to draw in order to grow your own fantasies, if I can stick to the plant metaphor. And you're now going into the really awesome work, I think, of literally maintaining the also material lore of your surroundings, and in many ways, and then also literary lore and these kinds of things. So, and you have been for a long time already. So I think there are different kinds of lore keepers, and I think the university is not my favorite kind, but it is also, that's an institution which attempts to keep the lore of the Western world, and also changes it to some degree, or influences how that world then continues to develop. And then like the lore of the 1800s is a very fascinating a very fascinating thing, I think. But yeah, I think there's a danger in our world, because of the immense luxury and means that we live in and have access to neglect our roles as law keepers and try to simply, I don't know, create in a hedonistic sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but what Brothers Grimm referred to it as, which I thought was quite appropriate. It's not the image that I first had in mind, but I think it's maybe even better, is the circle jerk that establishes itself when your only source material is the fantasy that other people have written. So you're no longer planting your plants in the ground. It's like a bird has left its droppings in a tree that's bigger than your own, and from those, and you are the droppings, and you are sort of growing the seeds that are in the droppings, but on another tree that's bigger, instead of trying to work with the ground that's actually there beneath you. And which is I think it's quite a harsh critique, but it's something that I wrestle with myself. So it comes from a place of understanding. But I think this is why, one should recognize that the primary office that one has if one wants to be a writer is to some degree lawkeeper in whatever capacity that is. Yeah.
I mean, there's a kind of it sounds almost similar to Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality, where this kind of understanding of the fantasy world as it currently is, of people are taking the sign rather than the thing that's represented by the sign as the primary reality, and then at some point they just lose all contact with the reality itself. The signified disappears, and so all you're left with is a sign. And of course, in the digital age, this is something that people go on about a lot. But I think functionally, there's a sense in which if you're just focusing on contemporary fantasy and only engaging with contemporary fantasy, and then be writing as a consequence in that way, then you're losing the thing which is signify might be the wrong word, but where it gains its nutrients from the roots are missing. You're left with the leaf at the top, which is withering because it's not actually being fed anymore. You're just putting two leaves together, which doesn't really work as a tree. But I guess a further question though is, okay, that all makes a lot of sense, but then are we saying, well, the folklore like has a cut off at 1800 or something like that, and then everything else is fantasy? That's a silly way to put it, but you kind of know what I'm saying here, which is that there could be a danger of saying, well, everything in the modern world isn't folklore, and actually can we actually develop folklore? Or develop might be the wrong word, but is there a way to kind of folklore to still be growing? Or is it, you know, it almost sounds like, oh, we can only just do the fantasy stuff, we can't actually do the folklore as well.
I think we can. I think well, yeah, that's why I'm going into the ministry of the word, for example. And that's why people get jobs in academia and so on. I just think so. I think there are big shifts that have taken place also through the process of nationalization and so on that happened in the 1800s and everything that followed, and that's how folklore, at least in the one of the things that I had to think of was the way it developed in Germany, where people like the Brothers Grimm, then, who were also mentioned in the previous stream, they collected all of this folklore in the form of fairy tales, and they used this among their contemporaries to build national identity and to give a sense of what it means to be German in that setting. And their neighbors then also, the smaller neighbors especially, tried to use it to build their own sense of identity and nationhood and so on. So I think that led to new lore developing, and we are also still in a world in which lore continues to develop. And then it's just a matter of where are you. So there is a local question that's involved with it, but then there's also a cultural question, like what defines your culture. We are both sitting in front of screens right now, so that probably means that the screen defines a large portion of our culture based on how we are sitting in front of them as well. And and I've been thinking a bit about how the screens in front of which we sit are in many ways a replacement to the bonfire or the hearth in the hall. Which is a concerning thought, but it's also simply the reality. But I think locally we still also do have hearths and halls and so on. And there is maybe a question there as well of how do we get involved with these? Can we see them? Do we see them? I think there has been a big move towards going to church again, or the establishment of neo-pagan movements. I've forgotten the name of the one neo-pagan historian that I've watched a bunch of recently.
Is it
But
Tom Rousel?
yes, it is. Yes, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Survive the
Who's
Jive.
yes, and he's quite eloquent and articulate in expressing his thoughts and so on, which are quite interesting. Also, in relation to the genetic identity of nations and so on, which I find very fascinating. So, yeah, I think that we live in a time that's like that has come after an empire, or we are in an empire. And one other thing that I wanted to address, maybe you can also, I don't know what your experience is with it, was the developments of the Greek world, because they do develop in a way that kind of shows or leads them to move or grow away from the foundation of Hesiod and Homer and the like. And they then develop their own kind of historiography, which is also no longer so Greco-centric, if one wants to call it that. It is in some ways, but then if you read Herodotus, for example, he's actually writing a story about a Persian emperor with a lot of excurses or whatever. And yeah, so there's also a similar movement. That's what I would try to compare it with off the cuff.
I mean, I think one thing I think about, you mentioned the Brothers Grimm, and I think one thing that is a very good comparison as well is just at that time you had the Industrial Revolution taking place across the West, and that led to a disruption of all of life in ways that we talk about our lives being changed by digital, but I think the technological revolution of the 1800s was probably far more significant in terms of how in England, I can speak to England primarily. The countryside, people left in their droves and moved to the cities for work, but that work was no longer that which their sires had done for countless generations, and it was very demeaning work often. And yet at the same time you had an increase in efficiency and mass productivity, and the whole world was upside down, and the rule of the coin seemed to be at hand. And it was in this context which people like the Brothers Grimm, in Britain you had Walter Scott and other figures, Thomas Carlyle, who are looking to these older myths again to recover something that they feel has been lost. And they find a certain identity in that, in the stories of King Arthur, or the folk tales of the Germanic peoples, the Ring Cycle, for example, of Wagner. These are all attempts to kind of recultivate that in an age where all the other things, all the traditions, all the hierarchies are being melted down, and so they're kind of taking resource in the one thing that's left, which is we're still here, the people with our culture. And I think to some extent we're going through that same thing again in a way. After, certainly in England, after the Industrial Revolution, I think there was a kind of settling down point where people didn't move around as much because you had your established industries in certain places. But now there's a lot of internal migration again because the old industries have died out, new ones have taken their place, and there's just a much more of a culture of individuals going to do jobs in different places. So we're kind of living through the same thing again, except we don't have the starting point that they did in the past, where they still had a living memory of their prior times. So yeah, that to me, that's another good comparison of this, for this current moment with the past.
I wonder if that with the living memory is necessarily true, though. I think in our age there are also still, I mean, it is true to a degree, but in recent times I've been thinking, I was raised with very good like catechesis from the earliest age, not only in my own home with under my parents, but also in the congregation in which I grew up. So that was a very thorough like training in the lore of my people in a sense, but it didn't connect me much to like the history of Germany per se and things like that. It was more a religious instruction, and then also rooted in the Bible and more universal kind of perspectives on things. But But oh goodness, now I've forgotten what I wanted to say. It had something to do with, oh yes, the living memory. So in a sense, I was plugged into the living memory of this of my faith, for which I am very grateful. But at the same time, in many ways, I feel like an outsider that is trying to find his way back into the history of the world, and among other things, my people according to the flesh, if I can call it like that, because that isn't what I was raised into. And then for that, there are memories that are more or less living, because you do have at least writings that are intelligible. And then, yeah, you also do have, I think, people that, yeah, have been passing on the tradition to a greater or lesser degree. And I think in previous times and eras, there's a similar pattern that there is probably often a majority that is disconnected, that then looks for orientation again and crawls back to the sources ad fontes, like the humanists said in the time of the Renaissance. So yeah, I think that there is always this kind of loss of identity, drifting away from the origin and the source, and then a desire to return, and for that one then seeks law masters out again.
Well, I mean, I think there's an interesting question there, though, and that, there is this perception. Let's take a very generic kind of perception, which is that, in the past everyone was a lot more religious, and today, the secularization has led to mass kind of people not going to church, decline in church attendance, and so on. But when you actually look at the record, certainly in this country, in the Victorian age, okay, they were building lots of churches, but most of them were not full. Some were, and there's no point in denying that. But at the time, there was a discussion in Scotland, in England, of a crisis of faith during the Victorian period, that people are not coming. And I'm not talking about Darwinian evolution and that kind of thing. I'm just talking about people coming to cities and not going to church. So, or the Reformation period in Scotland, estimates, because the Kirk session records of that period, Presbyterians were very good at keeping records. That's one of their great strengths. And because and so you can see like church attendance, and it's like 10% of the population in many towns are going to church. That's not what we're taught to believe, but actually that's part of the kind of reality there. So there is a kind of question here of, do we overinflate how committed people were to tradition and so on in the past, and thereby create a bigger sense of our own loss of it, whereas actually perhaps it's not always been as it's not always been as strong as maybe has been suggested.
And I think in England especially, there's a very interesting, I've been thinking about the parallels between England and all the British Isles and South Africa in recent times, because we've also got a number of very different populations that converge here, and then there's conflict and so on. But in England, you've got a very similar story where you've got the Brythonic Celts and the Irish and so on, I guess. And there's differences in identities there, apparently. So I don't know enough about it to speak too competently about it. You'll have to forgive me. But you've got these figures, and then you've got the Romans, and then there's a Christianization that takes place. And it's quite profound from what I understand, the Christianization. And then you've got, again, the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes and so on coming in, and they kind of cause a great catastrophe in the Christian landscape anyway. And then they are Christianized as well eventually, and they become great missionaries among the Germans. But after that, in the time of the Viking invasions and so on, it might be before that though, there's also a lot of like sermons that are really despairing of the spiritual state of England. So you've got these highs and lows seemingly. But I think it's always a question. you also mentioned in the previous episode the conflict in the Lord of the Rings. There's always that conflict pressing in from the outside, but the primary conflict is actually the one between the ring and the one who's tempted by its power. And I think it's the same in every generation. We are tempted to forsake father and mother when we are called to honor them by God, and also to fear, love, and trust God above all things, ultimately. So to seek him out in his house, despite the corruption of the clergy. But maybe that's also something one should fight for, to purify the clergy, even as lay people. But anyway, that's
well, I think that's a very good place to kind of bring the discussion to a close. Again, re-emphasizing that this is something for each of us to consider ourselves and to wrestle with. That's the primary task. Before we get going, is there anything you would like to promote, Philip?
Yes, I don't know when this will be coming out. There is a competition with the Corncrake for drawing castles, which I'm busy doing, and I'm very excited about. But I've also, as a lawkeeper, I'll just claim that title for myself. I've written a fantasy novel called The House of Noth, so I can take a look at that. And yes, the Corncrake magazine naturally is always great to read.
Well, I will say that I can thoroughly recommend The House of Noth. It's still one of my favorite novels that I've read, and it's it's just a great read. It's very different. I'm kind of stopping myself from saying too much, because I feel as soon as I start, then I'll give too much away, because it's just it's just quite incredible. It's what I would say is, if you like kind of your Lord of the Rings fantasy, there's elements of that, but it feels fresh, and to me that's enough of a blurb for me to buy a book. I don't know about anybody else. So yes, go and buy The House of Noth. Go and read it, and you may actually find on this channel that me and Philip did a video about it. So once you've read it, you can come back and watch the video. But in the meantime, thank you, Philip, for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and it's given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, thank you from my side as well. And it's also, I'm very grateful for the conversations always. It helps me push in new directions and gives me pushback from unexpected directions. So I'm very grateful for everything you do.
Well, my hope is now somebody in the audience is now watching and has been spurred to write a long comment and then come on to next week's episode. So if that's you, get it down now, and you'll be able to react to Philip's ideas in next week's episode. But in the meantime, thank you, Philip. Thank you to you, the viewer. It's been great to have you here. Remember to go to thecorncrakemag.com now, and we will see you next time. God bless you all. Bye for now.